It's the party that never ends. This one ends in 5 parts, but the one that leaves you feeling like you should dedicate your life to a deity and join a monastery after. At very least, you're going to need to shower the funk off of you after this one's finished. In part 1 of Party Crashers, we looked at a mid-modern examination of American Democratic Party politics, from Kennedy to Clinton, to help explain part of what led us to here, at least politically. First, before we examine the other layers of this illogical ideological lasagna. We talked about the big milestone events that set us on a course for our current socioeconomic political climate. I'm laying a foundation of politics in this season of Overthinking Everything, because that is truly one of the foundational components to explaining this cult-like phenomenon in our country today. I know, we're all just politicked out, but bear with me, because a lot of this is painfully fascinating. In this episode, we'll take a gander at some of what led the left going in circles in the first place, even before Watergate, before even the Kennedy assassination. If you've studied history, you can remember the middle school level, you might understand the basics. If not, part 2 of Party Crashers is a crash course in how the American political system got wrecked. The Democrats had been throwing off their back foot out of the pocket since the first snap. Since the game began, really. Actually, since the first player took the first knee at the first anthem, so to speak. Sorry. Football metaphors. That's another cult I've sort of given up as I'm overthinking everything and deconstructing a culture of cultism. And welcome to the podcast. One little fact we tend to gloss over in social studies class is that the Constitution wasn't unanimous amongst Americans. We like to fool ourselves into believing that the Revolutionary War was the American colonies against the tyrannical British Army. And we'll see that isn't quite the case, at least entirely. There was a war between colonists. Many anti-federalists, as they would be called, preferred a government more akin to the original Articles of Confederation. To make it easier, the difference between the two, the Articles of Confederation and the Constitution, without getting bogged down, the Constitution enabled a larger, and as they saw it, overly intrusive federal government, whereas the Articles of Confederation placed more governing in the power of individual states, with minimal involvement on the federal level. Now, I'll break that down for you in a little bit, but this is where the term states' rights comes up. You've probably heard that as a defense against the statement that the American Civil War was about slavery. Now it's about states' rights. Both things can be true and are. So the anti-federalist movement had been stirring for a while. Still, don't be fooled that there were just 2 schools of thought. Remember that back in the late 18th century, if you looked around the world, what we were trying to do hadn't really been done. A government, the way the Constitution presented, the Declaration of Independence, well, even the Articles of Confederation. This was uncharted territory for many involved and really hadn't been seen on this level since the Magna Carta, the document that our sacred texts were based on. And these were primitive times, 100+ years before Little House on the Prairie, for crying out loud. We can't even comprehend it. Everything by candlelight, man. Every day was glorified camping. I hate camping. So we went from no taxation without representation to we're still getting taxed, just differently and sometimes more, and we just have new people we never see in charge of it all. Okay, so what changed? Well, think about it. Without the internet, without your television, without your phone, without all this, if you only had a newspaper, which was pretty much what all they had back then if they were lucky, how informed do you think you would be? What would regulate and inform your opinions? How would you know what you were politically speaking? Most of these guys, they didn't even know what a president should do. There just weren't that many examples around. It's the 1700s, man. Lots of castles and barons and kings and royal ancestry, red wedding shit. A lot of different leaders and a lot of different titles, but Well, a president was sort of unprecedented. I love me some me. With the balance of powers, the checks and balances and all that, we had borrowed from other governments. We had borrowed a virtual smorgasbord of ideas to build our own. After all, once you leave mommy and daddy's house, maybe you don't want to put the toilet paper on the little dispenser rolly thing in your place. America was kind of the same way. Borrow what worked from back home, fill in the blanks with the rest, make up our own rules. The constitutional mad libs of the birth of a nation. So the idea back then that political parties, the way we have them now, it just couldn't occur to anyone. I mean, what America's political machine has turned into would simply horrify even the most corrupt of the founding fathers. It would offend them. And I'll defend that with offering this. Who could pass a purity test? Especially in light of social evolution. And purity tests be damned, I don't believe there's a single founding father who wouldn't be aghast at our forced sale to the highest bidder government. Now, I make a point not to speak for dead people or people I don't know. I try to speak my own opinion without assuming anyone else's. And any assumption I may make, I work very hard to make sure it's evidence-based. But my study of the founding fathers, the crafters of our nation, academically and independently, it tells me that while there was a broad diversity in specific beliefs among these non-diverse white men on issues like economics and humanity, and that while there was a disagreement in how the balance of powers should be distributed, I don't believe any of them, no matter the lean, would have fought as hard as they did to start something that has devolved into this. Yeah, let's talk about purity tests. Without digging too deep into some antiquated patriarchy, the purity test is sort of a baseline of expectations, right? In olden days, for a prominent young man to take a wife, she'd have to pass a purity test. Was she good enough? Was she pure enough by the standards set by whomever? Yes, it's so gross and misogynistic, but the phrase sticks and we use it for a wide array of topics. In this case, politics. And for, let's just say, an anti-federalist, which did spawn the Democratic Party, the purity test might be that you do not support a constitutional republic as was trying to be set forth with the Constitution of our little republic. So if you're trying to say you're an anti-federalist and you really dig that Constitution, man, yeah, give me more federal government, more Second Amendment, woohoo! Well, you're not going to pass the purity test of your fellow party mates. I know how confusing that was. This is why people just can't get this kind of stuff. We use purity tests all the time, though. For some, their choice in news has to pass some purity test before they'll even consider it news. For some, their makeup has to be ethically manufactured and tested. For others, the restaurant chain's corporate donations matter in whether they dine there. And where we shop, what we buy, whom we date, whom we let our children hang around with, they're all in some fashion a purity test. So, no. Historically, applying a purity test to men who owned slaves and lived scandalously in different times is problematic in and of itself. It's also problematic to hold others accountable for ideals they may have had at one point, but later changed their position on. Well, like me, for example. Oh boy, I'm ashamed of some of the stuff I said for a laugh. Truly. Aimed really low on a lot of those I did. I also think it's okay for someone to have said or done something and acknowledged how toxic it was, and for you not to believe them. Now, look, the older people get, the less likely we are to see change, and we know that change comes gradually. So, I'm not convinced what time period signifies an adequate separation from the toxic events. I just know that we all have our own purity tests, and then sort of this social purity test we have when applying, to other people. But we can't apply those modern purity tests to primitive people, places, or things. I hear these arguments about how the founding fathers were racists and owning slaves and all that. You can't make blanket statements like that just to justify an opinion. Because when you dig deep and you start studying the writings of these men, the writings between each other, There was conflict in the humanity of owning slaves and even acknowledgement that it was something America couldn't and shouldn't continue. Now, I use slavery as an example because this was probably, aside from the Constitution itself, one of the most divisive issues our young nation faced. Without superimposing too much of our modern ideologies onto our predecessors, let's look at where we've been, where we're at, and where we're going. We've covered a lot of the 20th century and some of the early struggles in the 18th century, 1900s and 1700s for those playing the home version of our game today. And to really understand where we're at today, we have to take a look at the 19th century, the 1800s. The 24 states at the time and their peoples were still pretty divided on the issue of the founding of our nation. Disagreements about what individual states had the rights to allow and enforce had always been at the root of American politics. A division was bred from the adoption of the Constitution that lasts to this day. It's resonated throughout history. And let me put it in a more relatable manner. Let's say that you and your siblings live at home with your toxic parents who kind of control you, make you work all the time, and pay them most of what you earn. They make you believe in their religion, go to their church, make you believe by their strict rules and culture. It's just best not to speak out against it too, So you and your brothers and your sisters, you're tired of it. You're old enough and strong enough to stand on your own, so you leave. Except that when you leave, well, you kind of leave on your parents' dime, and so they still enforce all the rules and make you pay even more because you're somewhere now that has more resources. So it kind of all comes to a head, and you tell your parents to bugger off. And you fight for the fight to prove your point that you can be on your own. You're independent from mom and dad. That's right, America. You're on your own insurance policy now, big guy. Now, you and your brothers and sisters, you're in your new place with almost unlimited resources, unimaginable potential, and with all your kids and some friends, and you've got this really cool thing going on, right? But it's hard to keep it going because more kids are leaving over there and leaving their parents and coming to do what you're doing, which looks pretty amazing, by the way. So chaos and confusion stir until some of the siblings step up and say, hey, we don't have parents, and there were a lot of things the parents took care of that made our lives easier. And then all the siblings went, yeah, man, and they all agreed. Till one of them said, right, so we all have to pick up our own slack and take personal responsibility for ourselves. That's what some of the other siblings gave each other that look, the one because maybe they had spent years picking up that sibling's slack and said, yeah, we were kind of thinking because not everybody's going to do their part all the time, that maybe someone should be the parents. Because having parents worked, having those parents didn't work, and maybe we could just pick which parents we want every, few years or so. And then they fought. They fought a lot. And thus, the Anti-Federalist Movement came to pass. While some of our founding fathers had crafted this beautiful document and a list of guaranteed rights, others felt like the original Articles of Confederation were sufficient. And having anything more than that was an overstep of federalism, which was something many early Americans were leery of thanks to the corrupt kingdoms from whence they came. Small government versus big government. After all, mom and dad were cold-hearted bastards, right? That's what we've always been told. I'll be damned if I'm just going to let some other mom and dad come in. Perspective. The Revolutionary War, the war for our independence, was fresh in America's memories, and the bloodshed was here on the home front. It was hard to find someone not affected by the war. These were legitimate fears a nation in her infancy would and should have. And among many, there were fears of abandonment and separation anxiety. While mommy and daddy were bastards, some things were easier. You can bet both sides did their fair share to convince others of their position, just like we do today. much differently in the manner it's disseminated, but absolutely the tactics are similar. Misinformation, lies, fear-mongering. What resulted was a nation torn, political parties fractured, and a people struggling to define themselves politically. Parties and groups emerged, but were extreme fringe shoot-offs of another group, and many struggled to garner enough support to really grab a foothold in the capital. At the turn of the century and up until the War of 1812, America is still trying to figure all this out. However, as the nation began to grow and the necessity and dependence of slavery, it was weighing heavily on our nation compared to the moral cost. The years following the War of 1812 saw a major economic struggle, our own growing population struggling to form her identity. America hadn't really had parties up until then. I mean, if you weren't on board with the Federalist Movement, the ones pushing the Constitution, then, well, you lost, right? I mean, it's never that easy, but while the people still had their individual opinions politically, it was pretty much the Federalists, right? The Founding Fathers. After all, James Madison, the author of the Bill of Rights, preceded James Monroe. And that would put us roughly around 1818. But as America grew and our values evolved, the Federalist Party, the one of John Adams' generation, crumbled and gave way to another lone party, a sort of moderate catch-all. The Democratic-Republican Party, hyphenated, was pretty much all that was left standing. Democratic-Republican Party, hyphenated. And to the republic for which it stands, we fight for democracy because America, thanks to the Constitution and how our balance of power is laid out, is a constitutional democratic republican. Well, actually, as we learned, we will learn in future episodes, that thanks in large part to FDR, America is actually a constitutional democratic socialist republic. That's a mouthful. And if it's kind of making your head spin with terms you're not used to hearing associated with us, strap in, because this is going to be a ride. America, at that time, had seen more than her fair share of wars and battles, and a weary and exhausted young nation in her early years of development was left traumatized. Like a child in an abusive household, those PTSD scars would resurface throughout our history. The fight for our independence was long and costly. It seemed they worked so hard just to be so divided. Trying to recover from the economic tolls of the War of 1812, as well as continued expansion, James Madison's term ended in 1917, and so went the generation that founded this nation. What do children do? They aspire to be bigger and better than their parents, right? In 1823, Madison's successor, James Monroe, had issued his doctrine, which guaranteed the U.S. would stand up to any European interference in the Latin countries on our continent seeking independence. While it sounded protective, it would also justify our own interference, which would set our role on the world stage as the defenders of democracy. Known for negotiating the states of Florida and the borders of the Oregon Territory, which by itself was an accomplishment, John Quincy Adams would win the presidency the year after the Monroe Doctrine passed. He was anti-slavery, and like his daddy, founding father John Adams, he could be a bit of a prick. More than 100 years before How to Win Friends and Influence People was written, JQA could have benefited from a book report. His entire presidency was met with scorn and division, and the question of legitimacy. And you think hanging Chads still losing despite a landslide popular vote, and even the 44 and 76 Democratic conventions were rough on America's claim on democracy? Oh, you ain't seen nothing yet. Wait till we get to 1824. Remember how I said we had one party at this time? Well, that is true. America's political landscape was representative geographically more so than ideologically. To relate it to today, imagine if our political parties really were geographic. We do see some of that in red state, blue state battles, sure, but what if it really was the Pacific, the Mountain, the Midwest, the Northeast and the Southeast regions. 1824 was a tricky year for sure, but if you think about where America was heading with one major party and geographic divisions within it, well, it wasn't headed for a United States. And it's hard to argue that had America continued down that path, we may speak different languages depending on what part of the country we lived in. Even though sometimes it seems like we do. Rather than two parties, two candidates whittled down through today's lengthy primary process, 1824 saw the Democratic-Republican Party, hyphenated, offering 5 candidates. 2 from the southern states, William Crawford and John C. Calhoun. 2 from the western states, Henry Clay and Andrew Jackson. Yes, Tennessee was west back then. And John Quincy Adams, the northern candidate. Boy, it gets choppy, but if you'll stick with me, man, because history, history does repeat. One party, 5 different candidates. It wasn't taking America long to get it. That's not one party. There's no unity there. There are at least 3 different ideological parties at play here. And in prime fashion and in like dramatic fashion, like a mini-series, you want to hear what's at the center of it all? The Electoral friggin' College. Remember the 2016 election when one candidate won the popular vote by a significant margin but still lost the office due to the Electoral College? Well, here we are. Every great story has a prequel, and this one surprisingly also has a Jar Jar Binks. The 1824 election was unique in that by then 75% of the states in the Union had decided they would select electors to the Electoral College by popular vote. Some were still choosing by state legislatures. So why does that matter? The states where they chose by state legislature often didn't log the popular vote, so there was no claim to the popular vote as it was. Still, the 1824 election was the first where the president did not win the popular vote as it could be counted. It was also the first where the president didn't win the Electoral College. With 5 candidates, a majority was needed, and the votes were split. In 1824, the votes and the nation seemed split between Andrew Jackson, Henry Clay, and John Quincy Adams. Henry Clay, known as the Great Compromiser, was one of the 19th century America's most notable politicians who never made it to the White House. California, Texas, Missouri, you can credit Clay for those states. Now, of course, America sold out the rights of a lot of slaves, former slaves, even free blacks alike, just to make that happen. But we'll cover that in a few. It's part of the Compromise of 1850, which included the Fugitive Slave Act of 1850. Yes, there is more than one Fugitive Slave Act. This is America. The nation was as divided as ever. But 1850? Now, that's a quarter-century jump in the stories. Whoa there, Seabiscuit. Just to say that Henry Clay had plenty more to do than just foobar an entire political system. So you remember how I told you John Quincy Adams' presidency was shrouded in cries of shenanigans? Well, thank Henry Clay for that one too. The 1824 election was the first and only time the 12th Amendment has had to be used. You may have heard about that one. That sends the election of the president to the House of Representatives if the process doesn't select a clear winner. Henry Clay, a great compromiser but not really a strategist, was quite boastful of his love of gambling. Ultimately, he gambled on his eventual White House ambitions and lost. A gifted orator and lawyer, Clay began his political life on the coattails of Jeffersonian ideals and would grow to be admired by Abraham Lincoln. So much so that so many of Clay's words appear in Lincoln speeches. Henry Clay's impact on this nation is immeasurable. Legislation and speeches aside, it was during this election, as the House of Representatives made their first-round voting, Clay was behind in the votes and unlikely to make it to the next round, so he threw his support behind his closest opponent in ideology, the erratic and obstinate John Quincy Adams. Adams won on the first ballot, shocking many in the House and the nation, as Jackson was the clear winner of the popular vote as it could be counted, and the clear favorite to be president. Henry Clay would eventually be appointed Secretary of State under President John Quincy Adams, which brought about a huge outcry by Jackson's supporters. And like Romulus and Remus, Isaac and Ishmael, we have before us, thanks to the complex and unique 1824 election, a cataclysm that would eventually evolve into our modern American political landscape. That's right, the Democratic-Republican Party, hyphenated, became the Democratic and Republican parties. The hell with hyphens, am I right? Andrew Jackson's loyalists, most of the country, became the Democrats. Meanwhile, the ideology behind Clay and Adams became the National Republican Party, which later would evolve into the Whig Party, which leads us to the Lincoln Republicans, which resemble nothing of the sort of the modern Republican Party we see today. And listen, this series focuses mainly on the Democrats because they're just the easier mess to explain. But man, when I get into the Republican Party, and I will... Oh, it's a mess, y'all. It's all over the place. John Quincy Adams' term was short-lived, stifled with obstruction within his own party's chaotic beginnings, as well as the new Democratic Party itself. First of all, people just didn't like the guy. The claims of corruption and conspiracy surrounding the election would be stirred by Jacksonian Democrats for the next several years. And in 1828, running on, quote, true Jeffersonian principles, Andrew Jackson would exact his political revenge. Andrew Jackson, our seventh Doctor, was a two-term president. Jackson was an early critic against an aristocratic lean and a warrior against corruption at the top of our nation, using his own experience 4 years prior as an example. Claims of a rigged election carried him to the top. Jackson also held true to the Democratic Party's foundational belief in the idea of natural rights, which may sound hypocritical considering the Trail of Tears, which was a cruelty and inhumanity that will forever tarnish Jackson's reputation and America's, and slavery too. Natural rights, the idea that humans are all granted basic rights, not by law or society, but basic human rights, just to exist. It was something the early founders of this nation held dear. Again, it's difficult to reconcile that without some serious historical sociology and psychology study, yet the atrocities to the native indigenous peoples of this land, as well as some of the attitudes of the early party on slavery, it makes it hard to sell to say that this party was founded on a principle by which it couldn't adhere. But again, natural rights back then, and considering the opposition wasn't exactly pro-free blacks, they were just anti-slavery. Natural rights has been at the root of the liberal movement, specifically the progressive wing of the liberal movement from the beginning. You'll hear many Democrats today talk about healthcare as a right. So this is really where a lot of that banter back and forth today comes from on healthcare as a right. While some will attempt to discredit the work of the Democrats by citing they were against the Constitution and for slavery, both things abstractly could be somewhat factual. But making a statement so broad sweeping and out of context is problematic. It just wasn't that simple. The anti-federalist movement, the ones who didn't want the Constitution, they didn't want a constitutional republic, that fermented and brewed the Democratic Party. Remember states' rights over federal oversight. That'll be a big story in 19th century America. Many Democrats, also Southerners, were also anti-abolitionist. And whether you want to argue that they were racists or merely representing their constituents, the moral quandary over slavery, it hangs over the heads and our history like a pall until something is done to right that sin. And I just don't think a purity test applies here. According to some of the writings of some of our most brilliant minds of the time and some of our most notable leaders, those writings provide us with the insight that even back then, many slave owners were struggling with the morality of it. So while maybe sometimes we can toss yeah, but it was a different time, with slavery, I don't think we get to do that. I don't think anyone gets a pass. Many of them seem to be critical, right? There was a social awareness, but a willful ignorance. And maybe my purity test is one's humanity against others. Still, back then, when the issue was slavery, it was more economic than humane, which makes it even worse, in my opinion. Understand that there was a lot to gain and lose over the issue of slavery. The years leading up to the Civil War, which we'll get to, were filled with two newly formed political parties battling it out for control of a presidency and control of a nation, starting to spin out of control, on the verge of an explosion. Following Jackson's run, Martin Van Buren, a man the press labeled Van Ruin, saddled with baggage of the 1837 financial crisis, where he was heavily criticized for bailing out the horse and buggy manufacturers. Okay, sorry, that was a joke, but Van Buren's single term was not impressive. I'm not saying Van Buren's presidency was bad, but his successor, William Henry Harrison, died in office after about a month, making way for John Tyler's single term. Tennessean James K. Polk became popular, hearkening back to some of Jackson's For the People policies. Polk supported annexing Texas for what it's worth, and Manifest Destiny was all the rage. Again, the Whig Party, the old National Republicans, were set for a disappointment after the guy they elected, Zachary Taylor, died of cholera 16 months in. See, the Republicans, they just can't keep a president alive in the 1800s. Now, let's be honest, and no historical disrespect here, cholera may have been America's ally on that one. Taylor's presidency was, as short-lived as it was a shameful disaster. I know, we're supposed to be talking about the struggles with the Democrats here, and I'll cover this more in another episode, but for just a moment, this is a critical turning point for modern American politics as well, because of the struggles that would follow. Remember Henry Clay, the guy who blew up America's politics a quarter century ago? Well, he's back with the Compromise of 1850. Passed as an appeasement to keep the nation from splitting, the Fugitive Slave Act of 1850 gave free rein for the capture of and return of blacks to slave owners, among other things, and it gave rise to bounty hunters. What ensued was a Wild West hunt through the streets, much like modern-day ICE with the Latinx community. And just about anybody who wanted to catch him one could be deputized. It didn't matter if the person was a free slave or a black person in the North who had never even been a slave. They could be kidnapped and taken to the South, and there wasn't a lot anyone could do about it. Unless you had the money to hire a lawyer, that is. Yeah. Corruption in our government back then. It was, to say the least, disastrous legislation, which fed into the eventual uprising, unrest, and secession. While it gave Texas her border and allowed California entry as a free state, because, back then every new state admission was a big negotiation on whether they would allow slaves or not, the cost on America's soul was permanent. It was the compromise to keep the Union together, but it would only serve to tear us apart. Cholera, while a nasty little disease back then, just wasn't quite fast enough. Zachary Taylor's presidency, his trademark policy, 1850's Fugitive Slave Act, was passed a couple of months after he died. His vice president and successor, Millard Fillmore, decided whether he agreed with it or not personally, he had to honor the legislation the president had supported rather than veto it. Tensions in our new little nation are high, and the issue of slavery was chief among the dividing issues. Race relations weren't what they are today. The mistake many make is examining history through modern lenses. In fact, the 3/5 Compromise told us everything we needed to know about how this country viewed African Americans. These weren't people to the American government. They were assets, like cattle, cannons, or a cabinet. Now, I'm being harsh, but there were a lot of sympathizers in America, humane people who saw blacks as people, equal or not, and there were a great many abolitionists within our government, fighting for the right thing. Just not that many of them were Democrats. And to understand that comes at a price. The price of losing a talking point. Democrats fought for slavery. Democrats started the KKK. I mean, yes. So the Democrats did fight for slavery, and so did some Republicans. The fact is, the division at the Mason-Dixon line was one of industrial and agricultural. Sure, but cultural as well. The South relied heavily on free or very, very, very cheap labor, while the North, where slavery was abolished, had to pay their workers. Hell, look at this period as the very reason unions exist. We know how bosses will treat their workers if we let them. So, economically, of course, the conservative Southern Democrats fought for slavery. It was the backbone of Southern economy. It's the biggest reason the South was even able to secede. That's right. The Southern states' secession from the North. The ultimate white privilege. Now think about it. Our entire economy was dependent on the slaves working and harvesting for free, or very minimal compensation. So if someone got elected and then told the Southern businessmen and landowners, hey, you know how you haven't been paying these folks for all the hard work they do for you? Yeah, you're really going to need to start paying them now. You could see why there might be some folks a little peeved, right? Look, I'm not trying to simplify one of the greatest acts of domestic terrorism and inhumanity America has ever committed, just to say that it wasn't in any way simple. And while by the time the actual Civil War began to take rise, there were many who actually acknowledged slavery should be abolished and just disagreed with how that should be handled. There are a lot of moving parts in any issue, and just saying, hey, y'all can leave, wasn't fair to the landowners or the slaves. How can slavery be fair? Fine. But simply put, one day all of these people have a place to live and some food to eat, yet they still lack skill, education, or training. And then all of a sudden they're homeless. Freedom, you know? But what happened to them after? That was the argument. Imagine if America did what the free slaves did with the Native Americans, shuffling them off into their own communities, living away from the white folks. None of that happened. Well, now back on track. Zach Taylor's policies, combined with the threat of secession over new state slave status, spelled his doom. Incidentally, one area, Zach and I sit on the same side of the fence. Taylor was a hardliner against secession and saw it as an act of treason against the Union. Hell, he offered to lead the army should there come a war over it. He talked about hanging those who would betray the Union by seceding. He was a charmer and a unifier, but his death paved the way for compromise and staved off the split of the Union for about 11 years. Millard Fillmore, not elected by the people, would be the last president of the Whig Party as it evolved into the Liberal Party of Lincoln 8 years later. Between then, widely regarded as the worst president in the history of these here United States, the conservative Democrat Franklin Pierce viewed the greatest threat to national unity, the Abolitionist Movement. Yeah, here's the thing about Pierce. He was a racist in a time when we needed compassion. Pierce's policies were downright cruel and inhumane. Some of the Fugitive Slave Act's worst years were under Pierce, and with different leadership, this could have been a period where America may very well could have avoided civil war. Or with someone with some diplomacy, who knows what the effects could have been. At that time, war seemed inevitable, sure. But instead of attempting to bring people together, Pierce's blatant disregard for the other perspective and his aggressive pursuit of anti-abolitionist legislation, it throws him to the bottom of just about every list of presidential rankings. All his presidency served to do was further divide a nation and guarantee the war. America needs a socio-political genius the likes of Jefferson, Washington, Franklin, Madison. America needed someone with vision. That was not Franklin Pierce. One term was enough for the party. Tensions were brewing and America was about to implode. Pierce wasn't even nominated for a second term. But his successor, James Buchanan, did nothing to help the cancer eating away at our nation. Imagine taking office just as the Civil War breaks out, and you really just don't address the elephant in the room. Buchanan, the conservative Democrat, supported the Supreme Court's ruling in the Dred Scott case and sided with the politicians in the South who sought to admit Kansas into the Union as a slave state. Again, here are the conservative Democrats, the party for the people, who are standing up for slavery. It's a hard pill to swallow, I promise, but as the Democrats supporting slavery should be a stain on their side, the Republicans' effort to use slavery as a political issue is their ugly cross to bear. Slavery wasn't just one party's shame. Slavery was America's shame. Admit it. It's all a lot to take in. It's like that part of the Bible where so-and-so begat so-and-so and so on. But just to say that leading up to the Republican Party's formation and their first successful presidential candidate, both the Democrats and the party that would become the Republicans, they were tripping all over themselves. Think about it. Since Andrew Jackson left office, nearly a quarter century passes until Lincoln. 24 years, 8 different presidents, 2 died in office. Both could be considered modern Republicans, 2 non-elected presidents, and it was a string of one-term presidencies. The Democrats scored back-to-back wins, but that hardly counts since it was Pierce and Buchanan. These parties are desperately trying to find themselves, a distinct parallel to what's happening to their constituents across this new country. Do you think voters felt well represented or well informed? We aren't even 100 years old, and already we're splitting apart at the seams. From the Revolutionary War to the Civil War, the wars that made America, we've sacrificed a lot, only to surrender the moral high ground consistently throughout history. History textbooks tend to skirt over what we discussed in the first episode of the season, that the evil and tyrannical England was on the verge of banning slavery, and America would have been forced to abandon slavery too, as a British colony. It was only through independence that America could sustain the lifestyle and economy it was building. Early founding fathers knew that the only way America could obtain her eventual manifest destiny was through the blood, sweat, and broken backs of slaves. The many abused, beaten, and dead bodies of millions of African non-consensually immigrated, non-consensual laborers. Coming up in part 3 of Party Crashers. As we've seen how the Democrats of before represent nothing the Democrats of today stand for, and the Republicans of today are in no way reflective of the early national Republicans, or Whigs, or even, well, in the next episode, we're going to pick up at the Civil War through Reconstruction and into the early part of the 20th century to one of the most influential presidents, but certainly nowhere near the list of the best, Woodrow Wilson. We'll also discuss the Roaring Twenties, the stock market crash up to the Great Depression, and the Second World War. These are a lot of events to cram into less than an hour, but we're examining them through the lens of political cultism and presidential party politics that led us to where we are today. It's corruption, scandal, backroom deals, and selling out the American people for the sake of American exceptionalism, imperialism, and expansion. Coming up as I deconstruct a culture of cultism. Thanks for joining. Like, share, and subscribe. And, do all the things. If you like this series, consider a donation to my Cash App or subscribe to Patreon. I'm Josh Brandon, and I'm overthinking everything.